The smell of fresh paint lingered in the hallways of 14 West Pinewood Apartments, a mid-century building that had seen better days. Sarah leaned against her apartment door, struggling with a stubborn grocery bag. The fluorescent light above flickered ominously, casting fleeting shadows on the walls. She glanced up, annoyed at the buzzing noise. "Maintenance is overdue again," she muttered under her breath. Sarah had lived here for 3 years, and while the building wasn't glamorous, it had a charm she couldn't explain. A sense of familiarity that made her feel at home. That changed the day a new neighbor moved in. Apartment 3B had been vacant for months. Everyone knew the previous tenant, Mrs. Fraser, a sweet elderly woman who'd passed away unexpectedly. Since then, the apartment had been lifeless, its darkened windows giving the hallway an unsettling air. But last week, the sound of heavy footsteps and the unmistakable scraping of furniture marked the arrival of a new resident. Sarah hadn't seen the person yet, only heard their odd hours, late-night movements, muffled voices, and an occasional loud thud. Curiosity itched at her, but something about the new tenant's presence felt wrong. One rainy evening, Sarah found herself face to face with the stranger. She was juggling her umbrella and fumbling with her keys when the door to 3B creaked open. A tall, gaunt man with deep-set eyes and pale skin stepped out. He wore a black coat that looked several sizes too large, and his hair was slicked back in a way that accentuated the sharp angles of his face. "Evening," Sarah said, offering a polite nod. The man's lips twitched into what could barely be called a smile. His voice, low and raspy, sent a chill down her spine. "Good evening." She waited for him to introduce himself, but he merely nodded and walked past her, his boots clicking against the tile floor. His smell, a mix of damp earth and something metallic, lingered long after he disappeared down the stairwell. Sarah couldn't shake the interaction. Over the next few days, she began noticing odd things about her new neighbor. He never seemed to leave during the day but was active late at night. The sounds of dragging furniture and faint, eerie humming often echoed through the thin walls. One night, while heading to the laundry room, Sarah spotted a faint light under the door of 3B. As she passed, she thought she heard whispers. Many voices, all speaking at once. She paused, her hand on the railing, straining to make sense of the noise. Just as she leaned closer, the light under the door vanished, and the hallway fell silent. Sarah hurried back to her apartment, her pulse quickening. Days later, a package arrived for 3B. The box was unmarked, wrapped in old brown paper and bound with twine. The deliverman, looking harried, handed it to Sarah. "Mind passing this to your neighbor?" "They weren't home," he said, already walking away. Sarah stared at the package. It was heavier than she expected, the weight uneven, as if something inside was shifting. Against her better judgment, she knocked on 3B's door. No response. She knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. She debated leaving the box at the door but felt uneasy about it. Instead, she brought it into her apartment, intending to deliver it later. She placed it on her kitchen counter and stared at it. The twine frayed in places, as though it had been tied and untied many times. Curiosity got the better of her. Sarah reached for a pair of scissors and carefully cut the twine. As the paper fell away, her breath caught in her throat. Inside was a small, ornate wooden box, its surface carved with symbols she didn't recognize. She lifted the lid cautiously. Nestled within was a strange object, a shard of what looked like a mirror, its edges jagged and sharp. Its surface was smeared with a dark, reddish substance that Sarah prayed wasn't blood. A sudden knock at her door made her jump, nearly dropping the shard. She quickly rewrapped the package and placed it on the counter. Her heart pounded as she opened the door to find her neighbor standing there, his dark eyes fixed on her. "That package," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "It's mine." Sarah nodded, too stunned to speak. She handed it over, her fingers brushing against his cold, clammy hand. He lingered for a moment, his gaze piercing, before turning and retreating to his apartment. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. Her thoughts kept circling back to the box, the shard, and the neighbor's unsettling demeanor. She decided to distract herself by catching up on some work, but was interrupted by a soft knock on her wall. 3 rhythmic taps. She froze. The taps came again, louder this time. Gathering her courage, she pressed her ear to the wall. A faint voice, whispering, reached her. "Help me." Sarah's blood ran cold. The voice was coming from 3B. Sarah's heart raced as the faint, desperate voice echoed through the thin wall. She backed away, her hand instinctively clutching her phone. Who could be whispering for help in that eerie apartment? Her new neighbor didn't seem like the kind of person who'd invite anyone over, let alone someone in distress. She stared at the wall for a moment, her mind battling between curiosity and fear. Finally, she decided to investigate. Grabbing her phone, she dialed her best friend, Emma, while making her way to the hallway. "Sarah? It's late. What's wrong?" Emma's groggy voice answered. "I heard something coming from my neighbor's apartment," Sarah whispered. "It sounded like someone asking for help." "Your creepy new neighbor? The one you were telling me about?" "Yeah, him. Something's off, Emma. I'm gonna check it out." "Are you insane? Don't go near that place. Call the police if you're worried." Sarah hesitated at Emma's warning but found herself drawn to 3B's door anyway. "I'll be fine. I'll just knock and see if everything's okay." "Sarah, no." She hung up before Emma could protest further. Standing outside 3B, she noticed the door looked old and worn, the paint chipped near the edges. She knocked 3 times, each sound reverberating through the silent hallway. Nothing. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. "Is everything okay in there?" Still nothing. Sarah leaned closer, pressing her ear to the door. The faint whispers returned, too muffled to decipher but unmistakably there. She twisted the doorknob, expecting it to be locked, but to her surprise, the door creaked open slightly. A cold draft wafted out, carrying the faint smell of damp wood and something metallic. "Hello," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. The apartment was dark, the only light coming from a flickering bulb in the far corner of the living room. Shadows danced on the walls, twisting into shapes that made her stomach churn. She stepped inside, her shoes crunching on something brittle scattered across the floor. Her eyes adjusted to the dim light, revealing the source of the crunching. Shards of broken glass littered the floor, their edges glinting menacingly. Her breath hitched when she noticed a mirror on the far wall. It was massive, its ornate frame tarnished with age. The glass was cracked in several places, and for a moment, she thought she saw movement within its fractured surface. "Is anyone here?" Sarah called, her voice echoing unervingly in the small space. A faint scuffling sound came from the bedroom. She inched closer, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. The door was ajar, and she pushed it open with a trembling hand. Inside, the room was sparsely furnished. A bed with rumpled sheets, a nightstand, and a single chair facing the window. On the bed lay a journal, its leather cover worn and faded. She hesitated before picking it up, her curiosity outweighing her fear. Flipping through the pages, she found erratic handwriting that grew more frantic with each entry. "The whispers won't stop. They know I've seen it. The mirror is cursed. I shouldn't have brought it here. It shows me things that can't be real." Her stomach twisted as she read further. The entries became more incoherent, filled with frantic sketches of figures with hollow eyes and twisted smiles. One phrase was scrawled repeatedly across the final pages. "The mirror lies." A loud crash from the living room made her drop the journal. She spun around, her pulse racing. "Hello? Who's there?" she called, her voice cracking. The mirror in the living room now glowed faintly, casting an eerie light that illuminated the shattered glass on the floor. As Sarah approached, she noticed her reflection wasn't moving in sync with her. Her reflection smiled. Sarah froze, every instinct screaming at her to run, but her legs felt like lead. The smile widened unnaturally, stretching across the reflection's face in a grotesque parody of joy. Then it raised a hand and pointed behind her. A chilling breath tickled the back of her neck. She whipped around, but the room was empty. When she turned back to the mirror, her reflection was gone. The glass showed only the room, distorted and warped by the cracks. A deep, guttural voice rumbled from within the mirror. "You shouldn't have come here." Sarah stumbled back, her foot catching on the edge of the rug. She fell hard, shards of glass cutting into her palms. The voice echoed again, louder this time, reverberating through the apartment. "Leave before it's too late." Sarah scrambled to her feet and bolted out of the apartment, slamming the door behind her. Her heart pounded as she leaned against the wall, trying to catch her breath. "Sarah?" A voice called softly. She jumped, spinning around to see her neighbor standing at the top of the stairs, his expression unreadable. "Is something wrong?" he asked, his voice calm but unnervingly flat. Sarah shook her head, unable to form words. The man's eyes lingered on her for a moment before he turned and entered 3B, closing the door behind him. She stumbled back into her own apartment, locking the door and collapsing onto the couch. Her hands trembled as she replayed the events in her mind. The journal, the mirror, the voice. None of it made sense. She glanced at her phone, debating whether to call Emma or the police. Before she could decide, her phone buzzed with a new text. "Don't go back to 3B. It's watching." The message was from an unknown number. Sarah stared at the text, her hands trembling. The screen glowed eerily in the dimly lit apartment. "Don't go back to 3B. It's watching." Who sent the message? How did they know what had just happened? She tried to reply, but the number was untraceable. Her stomach churned as dread settled in. What was she dealing with? Despite her fear, her curiosity clawed at her. There had to be an explanation, a logical one. Her rational mind tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was a prank, maybe the new neighbor was just strange, or maybe she was imagining things. Yet deep down, she knew none of those answers fit. The next morning, sunlight streamed through her windows, providing a false sense of safety. Sleep had evaded her, and her thoughts were consumed by the haunting events of the night before. The mysterious journal, the glowing mirror, the chilling whispers. It all felt like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. She decided to confront Emma. At a nearby cafe, Sarah recounted the events over coffee. Emma listened, her brow furrowing with concern. "You actually went inside his apartment?" "Sarah, that's insane," Emma hissed, her voice low but sharp. "I know, but I couldn't ignore it. And now, someone sent me this text." Sarah handed her the phone. Emma read the message and frowned. "You need to report this. The police can track the number." "And tell them what?" "That I heard whispers and my reflection smiled at me." Sarah interrupted, her voice laced with frustration. Emma sighed, leaning back in her chair. "Fine, but promise me you won't go near that apartment again. Whatever's going on, it's not worth risking your life." Sarah nodded, but her mind was already elsewhere. That evening, Sarah found herself pacing her apartment. The thought of 3B gnawed at her, a mix of fear and fascination. The journal's ominous warnings echoed in her mind. The mirror lies, what did it mean? Unable to resist, she searched online for any information about the building, particularly 3B. What she found sent a chill down her spine. An old article popped up about a man named James Halstead, a previous tenant of 3B. He had vanished under mysterious circumstances years ago. The police investigation turned up no evidence of foul play, but neighbors reported strange occurrences in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. Flickering lights, unexplained noises, and shadows moving in empty rooms. Sarah's pulse quickened as she read the article. Could the journal have belonged to James? And if so, what happened to him? As night fell, Sarah resolved to learn more. She couldn't live with the unease gnawing at her. Armed with a flashlight, she returned to the hallway outside 3B. The air felt colder here, and the dim lighting only added to the oppressive atmosphere. She pressed her ear to the door. Silence. No whispers, no movement. For a moment, she considered leaving, but the need for answers pushed her forward. The door was locked this time. Her heart sank, but as she turned to leave, she noticed something on the floor. A folded piece of paper peeked out from under the door. She hesitated, then crouched to pick it up. The paper was yellowed and fragile, as though it had been there for years. Scrawled in frantic handwriting were the words, "It knows you're here. Get out before it's too late." A shiver ran down her spine. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, but her feet stayed rooted to the spot. Suddenly, the hallway lights flickered, plunging the corridor into darkness. Sarah's flashlight wavered as she turned it on, its weak beam casting eerie shadows on the walls. A sound came from inside 3B, a faint scratching, like nails dragging across wood. She stumbled back, her flashlight shaking. The scratching grew louder, more frantic. Then it stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing against her ears like a physical force. She turned to flee, but the doorknob rattled. Her breath caught in her throat as she watched it twist slowly, deliberately. The door creaked open an inch, and cold air rushed out, carrying the same metallic smell she'd noticed before. "Hello," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The only response was a low, guttural growl, emanating from the darkness beyond the door. Sarah backed away, her flashlight flickering as if responding to the energy in the air. She tripped over her own feet, falling to the floor as the growl grew louder. The door slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. The hallway lights flickered back to life, and everything fell silent again. Breathing heavily, Sarah scrambled to her feet and bolted to her apartment. She locked the door behind her and sank to the floor, tears streaming down her face. Later that night, as she lay in bed, her phone buzzed. She flinched, the memory of the last text fresh in her mind. The message was from the same unknown number. "You've been warned. It won't let you go now." The screen glitched momentarily, the text distorting before disappearing entirely. Sarah stared at her phone, paralyzed with fear. Her reflection in the darkened screen smiled back at her. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she tossed her phone onto the nightstand. The unnatural smile in her reflection lingered in her mind, replaying over and over like a nightmare she couldn't escape. She buried her face in her hands, willing herself to wake up, but the cold grip of reality held her firm. By the next morning, the apartment felt different. The once comforting hum of the building's heating system seemed ominous, the walls too quiet, as if they were waiting for something to happen. Shadows lingered in the corners longer than they should have, and even the sunlight streaming through the windows did little to ease the growing tension. Sarah decided to act. She couldn't endure another sleepless night or another eerie encounter. Gathering her courage, She called the building manager, Mr. Thompson, a gruff older man with a perpetual scowl. 3B, Mr. Thompson repeated, his voice tinged with irritation. What about it? I need to know more about it, Sarah said, trying to keep her tone steady. There's something wrong with that apartment. The line went silent for a moment, and she could hear the faint rustling of papers in the background. Listen, Ms. Ward, I don't know what you're talking about. No one's complained about that unit before. That's not true, Sarah pressed. I found an article about a man who disappeared there, James Halstead. And there's someone living there now who... Nobody lives in 3B, Mr. Thompson interrupted sharply. His words hung in the air like a lead weight. What? Sarah asked, her voice faltering. The unit's been vacant for years, he said. I'm not sure what you think you've seen, but I can assure you, no one's been there. Before she could argue, he hung up. Sarah stared at her phone, her thoughts racing. If no one was living there, then who or what had she seen? And why did it feel like the apartment was pulling her deeper into its mystery? Desperate for answers, Sarah reached out to Emma again. They met in the park, a neutral space where Sarah hoped she could think clearly. She explained everything Mr. Thompson had said, the strange warnings, and the horrifying events that had unfolded. You need to leave, Emma said firmly, gripping Sarah's hand. This isn't just weird. It's dangerous. I can't, Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. It's like, it won't let me. I feel trapped. Emma hesitated before pulling a small notebook from her bag. Then we'll figure this out together. I looked into James Halstead, too. He wasn't the first to disappear in connection with 3B. What do you mean? Sarah asked, her throat dry. Emma flipped through the pages. There's a pattern. Tenants, maintenance workers, even delivery people. Anyone who spends too much time near that apartment either vanishes or ends up different. It's like the place changes them. The words sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. Why didn't anyone shut it down? Evict everyone? Emma shook her head. The building's history is murky. Owners change hands. Records go missing. It's like someone wants to keep it hidden. That evening, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the pipes set her on edge. The journal she had taken from 3B sat on her coffee table, its worn cover calling to her. Against her better judgment, she opened it again. The handwriting grew more frantic as the entries went on, the words spilling across the pages in chaotic lines. It's in the walls. The mirror shows its true form. Don't look for too long. It sees you too. Sarah's hands trembled as she turned to the final entry. Scrawled in bold, uneven letters. The door is the key, but the key is cursed. Don't let it out. A knock at her door made her jump. She froze, her pulse racing. It was late, too late for visitors. The knock came again, louder this time. She crept to the peephole, her breath hitching as she peered through. Nothing. The hallway was empty. Her phone buzzed, startling her. She picked it up hesitantly, expecting another chilling message. Instead, it was Emma. Are you okay? Emma asked, her voice urgent. There's someone outside, Sarah whispered. Don't open the door, Emma said quickly. I'll come over. Just stay put. Before Sarah could respond, the line went dead. The knocking resumed, more insistent now. A cold draft seeped under the door, chilling her feet. Who's there? She called out, her voice shaking. No answer. She backed away, clutching her phone. The knocking stopped abruptly, replaced by a sound that made her blood run cold. A low, raspy whisper, speaking her name. Sarah. Her knees buckled, and she sank to the floor, covering her ears. The whisper grew louder, more guttural, filling the apartment with an unnatural echo. Sarah. The lights flickered, and the air grew heavy. Her vision blurred as the whisper turned into a deafening roar, and then silence. When she opened her eyes, the apartment was dark. The journal lay open on the coffee table, its pages blank, as though the words had never existed. Her phone buzzed again. This time, the message was a video file. With trembling hands, she opened it. The footage was grainy, but she recognized the hallway outside her apartment. The camera panned slowly, stopping at her door. The door creaked open on the screen, revealing her apartment bathed in a sickly green light. And standing in the doorway was her own reflection, grinning back at her. Sarah stared at the video, her mind spinning in a whirlwind of terror and disbelief. Her reflection, the thing that had smiled unnaturally at her, was in her apartment. The video ended abruptly, leaving her phone screen black, as though mocking her with the silence that followed. Her apartment felt suffocating, the air thick and heavy as if the walls were closing in. She grabbed her keys and jacket, the instinct to flee overwhelming. Whatever was happening, she needed to get out. The hallway stretched before her, dim and uninviting. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, flickering with an erratic rhythm that made her feel like she was walking through a nightmare. As she approached the elevator, her breath caught. The elevator doors stood open, but the space beyond was pitch black, an impenetrable void. A faint metallic groan echoed from the shaft, sending chills down her spine. "No," she whispered, stepping back. Taking the stairs was her only option. The stairwell felt no safer. The sound of her footsteps bounced off the walls, creating a ghostly echo that made it seem like someone, or something, was following her. As she descended, her grip on the railing tightened, her knuckles turning white. She reached the lobby and paused, peering around cautiously. It was eerily quiet, the usual hum of life absent. The front desk, usually staffed by the cheerful doorman, was deserted. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. No response. She hurried toward the front doors, but as her hand reached for the handle, a loud crash echoed from behind her. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. A figure emerged from the shadows near the mailroom. It was tall, its features obscured by the dim lighting, but its presence radiated malevolence. "Who's there?" Sarah demanded, her voice breaking. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it began to move toward her, slow and deliberate. She shoved the door open and bolted outside, the cool night air hitting her like a slap. The streets were eerily empty, the city's usual bustle replaced by an unnatural stillness. Her destination was clear: Emma's apartment. If anyone could help her piece together what was happening, it was her best friend. Emma's building was only a few blocks away, but the journey felt interminable. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed alive, every corner hiding unseen eyes. When she finally reached Emma's door, she pounded on it desperately. "Emma, it's me. Open up." The door swung open, and Emma pulled her inside, her face pale and lined with worry. "Sarah, what's going on?" "I've been trying to call you," Emma said, closing and locking the door behind them. Sarah pulled out her phone, her hands shaking. "Look at this," she said, opening the video. But when she played it, the video was gone. Her gallery was empty, every file erased. "I swear it was there," Sarah stammered, her eyes wide with panic. Emma placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's okay. Just start from the beginning." As Sarah recounted everything, the journal, the mirror, the messages, and the video, Emma listened intently, her expression darkening. "This isn't just some haunting," Emma said finally. "It's like the apartment itself is alive, feeding off you." "What do I do?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Emma opened her laptop and began typing furiously. We need to find out more about the building, the previous owners, anything that could explain what's happening. Hours passed as they dug through obscure forums, old news articles, and public records. A pattern began to emerge: stories of disappearances, strange phenomena, and chilling coincidences, all tied to Sarah's building. One name kept appearing: Edward Vance. He was the architect, Emma said, her voice hushed. He designed the building in the 1920s, but he disappeared before it was completed. Some say he went mad, obsessed with the idea of creating a perfect gateway. Gateway to what? Sarah asked, dread pooling in her stomach. Emma shook her head. I don't know, but whatever it wasn't good. Look at this. She turned the screen toward Sarah, showing a faded blueprint of the building. The layout was strange, almost labyrinthine, with odd, overlapping rooms and dead-end hallways. And at the center of it all was 3B. It's like he built it to trap something, Emma said. The realization hit Sarah like a blow. The apartment wasn't haunted. It was a prison, and she had unwittingly become its warden. As they sat in stunned silence, Sarah's phone buzzed. She hesitated before picking it up, dread creeping into her chest. A new message flashed on the screen. You can't run forever. Emma grabbed the phone, her face pale. It knows you're here. The lights in the apartment flickered, and a low hum filled the air, growing louder and more menacing. Emma's laptop screen glitched, lines of static distorting the image. We need to leave, Emma said, her voice trembling. But as they stood, the hum turned into a deafening roar. The apartment shook violently, and the walls seemed to ripple, like a mirage in the desert. The front door slammed shut on its own, the locks clicking into place. Sarah, Emma whispered, pointing to the mirror in the hallway. Their reflections stared back at them, but they weren't right. Emma's reflection was smiling, a cruel, twisted grin that didn't match her terrified face. And Sarah's reflection was gone. The roar stopped, plunging the apartment into an eerie silence. Where is it? Sarah whispered, stepping closer to the mirror. Emma grabbed her arm. Don't, but it was too late. A hand shot out from the glass, cold and wet, grabbing Sarah's wrist. She screamed as the hand yanked her forward, her body halfway into the mirror before Emma could grab her other arm. Hold on, Emma shouted, pulling with all her strength. The hand released Sarah suddenly, sending them both sprawling to the floor. The mirror cracked, a spiderweb of fractures spreading across its surface. The apartment fell silent once more, but the damage was done. In the broken shards of the mirror, Sarah saw glimpses of something horrifying. Dark figures moving in the shadows, eyes glowing with malevolence. And they were watching her. The air in Emma's apartment felt heavy, as though the room itself had absorbed the terror of what had just happened. Sarah and Emma sat on the floor, staring at the fractured mirror. The cracks seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive, radiating a subtle, ominous energy. We can't stay here, Emma said, breaking the silence. Her voice trembled, but there was a steely determination in her eyes. Whatever this is, it's not stopping. It's getting worse. Sarah nodded, her breath shallow. But where can I go? It's following me, Emma. It doesn't matter where I am. Emma stood and grabbed her laptop from the coffee table, opening it with a shaky hand. We need more information. If Edward Vance really built your apartment as some kind of gateway, there has to be a way to stop it. The two women dove back into their research, poring over every scrap of information they could find about Edward Vance and the building's history. The deeper they went, the darker the story became. Vance had been a recluse, obsessed with the occult. His journals, which had been partially preserved in old archives, detailed rituals and symbols that made Sarah's skin crawl. Listen to this, Emma said, reading aloud. The room must remain occupied, or the veil will thin. If the gate opens, the watchers will come. Occupied? What does that mean? Sarah asked, leaning closer. Emma scrolled further. It sounds like your apartment is some kind of seal. Someone has to live there to keep whatever's on the other side from breaking through. Sarah shivered. And if no one does? Emma hesitated, then clicked on another link. The screen filled with grainy black and white photos of missing persons, all tied to the building. I think we're already seeing the answer. As the hours passed, Emma's apartment grew colder, the temperature dropping inexplicably. Sarah pulled a blanket around herself, but the chill seeped into her bones. Emma noticed it too, rubbing her arms and glancing nervously at the windows. It's here, isn't it? Sarah whispered. Emma didn't answer. Instead, she closed the laptop and stood. We need to go to your apartment. What? Why? Sarah's voice rose in alarm. That's the last place I want to be. I know it sounds insane, but if we're going to figure this out, we need to face it head on. There might be something there. Something Vance left behind that can help us. Sarah hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to refuse. But Emma's resolve was unshakable, and deep down, Sarah knew she couldn't run forever. The walk back to the apartment building felt like a death march. The streets were eerily quiet, the city's usual hum replaced by an oppressive stillness. When they reached the building, Sarah hesitated at the entrance, her hand hovering over the doorknob. We're in this together, Emma said, giving her a reassuring nod. Sarah took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The building's interior was worse than she remembered. The walls seemed to loom closer, and the air was thick with the scent of mildew and something metallic, like blood. The elevator doors were still ajar, revealing the pitch-black void beyond. Emma pulled out her phone, turning on the flashlight. Let's take the stairs. The climb was agonizing, each step echoing like a gunshot in the silence. When they reached Sarah's floor, the hallway was bathed in an unnatural gloom. The lights flickered erratically, casting long, twisting shadows. Her apartment door stood slightly ajar. Did you leave it open? Emma asked. Sarah shook her head, her throat too tight to speak. They exchanged a nervous glance before Emma nudged the door open with her foot. The apartment was a wreck. Furniture was overturned, and the walls were covered in deep scratches, as though some massive animal had been trapped inside. The mirror in the hallway was shattered completely, shards of glass littering the floor. But it was the writing on the walls that made Sarah's blood run cold. Leave or face the watchers. The words were scrawled in a dark, sticky substance that smelled faintly of iron. Emma moved cautiously through the apartment, her flashlight sweeping the room. Look for anything that might explain this. A book, a symbol, anything. Sarah's gaze fell on the journal she had found earlier, now lying open on the coffee table. She picked it up, her hands trembling, and flipped through the pages. Toward the back, there was a series of diagrams, intricate, otherworldly symbols that seemed to pulse on the paper. Emma, she called softly, holding up the journal. Emma hurried over, her eyes widening as she examined the pages. These look like sigils. I've seen something like this before in old texts about banishment rituals. Do you think we can use them to stop this? Sarah asked, her voice shaking. It's worth a shot, Emma said, but we'll need to recreate them exactly, and I think we'll need to perform them in the room where this all started. Sarah's stomach churned. You mean 3B? Emma nodded grimly. The idea of returning to 3B filled Sarah with dread. But she knew they had no choice. Armed with the journal and a makeshift kit of candles, chalk, and salt, they made their way to the third floor. The hallway leading to 3B felt different this time, heavier, as though the air itself was resisting their presence. When they reached the door, it swung open on its own, revealing the dark interior. Emma took the lead, stepping inside and setting up their materials in the center of the room. "Stay close to me," she instructed. Sarah nodded, clutching the journal tightly as Emma began drawing the symbols on the floor. The chalk lines seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, the air around them humming with energy. As Emma lit the candles, the room grew colder. A low, guttural sound filled the air, like the growl of a distant storm. Shadows began to move along the walls, twisting and writhing like living things. "Read the incantation," Emma said, her voice tight with fear. Sarah opened the journal to the page with the symbols, her hands trembling as she read the strange, ancient words aloud. The growling grew louder, the shadows closing in around them. Suddenly, the candles flared brightly, their flames turning an eerie blue. The room shook violently, and a deafening roar filled their ears. The shadows coalesced into a single towering figure, a monstrous entity with glowing eyes and elongated limbs. "Keep reading," Emma shouted. Sarah's voice wavered but didn't falter. The entity let out an ear-piercing screech, lunging toward them, but it was stopped short by the glowing symbols on the floor. It clawed at the barrier, its movements frantic and filled with rage. The final words of the incantation echoed in the room, and the entity let out a final, blood-curdling scream before dissolving into nothingness. The room fell silent, the oppressive weight lifting as the symbols on the floor faded. Emma and Sarah sat in stunned silence, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The apartment was still, the air no longer heavy with malevolence. "Is it over?" Sarah whispered. Emma looked around, her expression cautious. "For now. But I think this is just the beginning." Sarah's heart sank. She had survived the night, but the horrors of 3B and the secrets of the building were far from over. The aftermath of the encounter in 3B left Sarah and Emma shaken. They walked back to Emma's apartment in silence, their steps heavy with exhaustion. The night outside was eerily quiet, as though the entire world had paused to catch its breath. When they reached the apartment, Sarah collapsed onto the couch, her hands still trembling. "I don't know how much more of this I can take," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Emma sat beside her, setting the journal on the coffee table. "We're making progress," she said, though her voice betrayed her own lingering fear. "Whatever that thing was, we stopped it. At least for now." "But it's not over," Sarah said, staring blankly at the floor. "You said it yourself, this is just the beginning. What happens when it comes back? What if we can't stop it next time?" Emma hesitated, searching for an answer that wouldn't feel hollow. "We'll be ready," she said finally. "We just need to keep digging. There's more to this story, something we're missing." As the sun rose, casting a pale light over the city, Emma and Sarah pored over the journal again, focusing on the strange symbols and cryptic notes. The name Edward Vance appeared repeatedly, along with references to the Watchers and the Veil. "What are these Watchers?" Sarah asked, tracing the words with her finger. Emma frowned. "I'm not sure, but they seem to be connected to whatever is happening here. Maybe they're what's on the other side of this veil." The thought sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. If they're on the other side, why are they trying so hard to get through? "Power, maybe," Emma said, flipping through the pages. "Or revenge. Whatever Vance did to trap them, they're clearly not happy about it." As Emma spoke, Sarah's phone buzzed on the table. She grabbed it, frowning when she saw an unknown number. Hesitantly, she answered. "Hello." A deep, gravelly voice came through the line, sending chills down her spine. "You shouldn't have interfered." The call disconnected before Sarah could respond. She stared at the phone in horror, her heart racing. Who was it? Emma asked, noticing her friend's pale face. I don't know, Sarah said, her voice shaking, but they know what we did. The warning call left them on edge, but there was no time to dwell on it. The journal mentioned another location tied to Edward Vance, a hidden basement beneath the building. Of course there's a creepy basement, Sarah muttered as they descended the narrow staircase at the back of the building. The air grew colder with each step, and the faint scent of damp earth filled their noses. At the bottom of the stairs, they found a rusted metal door. Emma pushed it open with effort, revealing a dark, cavernous space lined with crumbling stone walls. The basement was filled with strange artifacts. Candles melted into grotesque shapes, jars of unidentified substances, and more of the ominous symbols they had seen in the journal. In the center of the room stood a large stone slab, its surface etched with intricate carvings. This is it, Emma said, her voice hushed. Sarah approached the slab cautiously, her eyes scanning the carvings. It looks like some kind of altar, Emma nodded. Vance must have used it for his rituals. Maybe this is where he sealed the Watchers. As they examined the room, Sarah noticed a faint light emanating from a crack in the far wall. She approached it, her curiosity outweighing her fear. Emma, look at this, she said, pointing to the light. Emma joined her, running her fingers along the crack. There's something behind this wall. Using a crowbar they found among the artifacts, Emma pried at the crack until the wall crumbled away, revealing a hidden chamber. Inside was a small, ancient-looking box covered in dust. What do you think it is? Sarah asked, staring at the box with a mix of awe and dread. Emma reached out to pick it up, but the moment her fingers touched it, the room shook violently. The candles flickered, and a low, guttural growl filled the air. Put it down, Sarah screamed, but Emma was frozen in place, her eyes wide with terror. The growling grew louder, and the shadows in the room began to move, twisting and writhing like living creatures. The temperature plummeted, and Sarah's breath came out in visible puffs. Emma, she shouted, grabbing her friend's arm and yanking her away from the box. The moment Emma let go, the shaking stopped, and the growling faded. What the hell was that? Emma gasped, clutching her chest. Sarah didn't answer. Instead, she stared at the box, which now seemed to pulse faintly with an unnatural light. I think it's some kind of containment device. Maybe it's holding whatever Vance sealed away. Emma shook her head. If that's true, we can't leave it here. If someone else finds it, or if it breaks, Sarah interrupted, her voice grim. They carefully wrapped the box in an old cloth and carried it back to Emma's apartment. Once there, they set it on the table and stared at it, unsure of what to do next. We need to destroy it, Sarah said finally. Emma hesitated. What if destroying it releases whatever's inside? Then what do we do? Sarah asked, her frustration boiling over. We can't keep it here and we can't leave it behind. Every second we have it, we're in danger. As they debated their next move, a sudden knock at the door made them both jump. Emma approached cautiously, peering through the peephole. It's the landlord, she whispered, her brow furrowing. Don't open it, Sarah hissed. But Emma ignored her, opening the door a crack. The landlord stood in the hallway, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. You need to leave, he said, his voice trembling. Now? Why? Emma asked, her grip tightening on the door. They're coming, the landlord said, his gaze darting nervously down the hallway. The Watchers. They know you found the box, and they won't stop until they get it back. The landlord's words sent a chill through both women. Before Emma could respond, the lights in the hallway flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. A low, guttural growl echoed through the building, and the landlord's eyes widened in terror. Run, he whispered, The last thing Emma and Sarah saw before slamming the door shut was the landlord being dragged into the darkness by an unseen force,